Right, sorry that we're starting so late. Actually wanted to say thank you for the gift from last year. Before Rosh Hashanah, it was a long time ago, but I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. That's here. I didn't really have a chance to tell all of you together until now, so I really appreciate it.
I'll have to say it again when the yell comes.
So he can watch on the recording.
Hey, fool.
I don't know. Ma'ishkacha Pratis, the one time he's late, we're starting late also, so maybe he won't miss much.
Right.
All right. It's very appropriate that at the beginning of a new season we start the first class late. It's a Jewish start, right?
Okay.
All right. Can I borrow someone's watch, please?
Mm-hmm.
All right. We are on chapter 9, believe it or not. We finished before Rosh Hashanah, chapter 8. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we had sort of we studied something else, although it was related. And now we are beginning chapter 9 of the Tzemach Tzedek's Mitzvahs Hamanas Alikus, the mitzvah of having faith in God, as mentioned as contained in his famous work, Derech Mitzvosecha, explaining all of the mitzvahs. Now, we've so far until now we have very good general grounding in, so to speak, what you might call the metaphysics or the nature of God's relationship to the world, more or less, as described in Chassidus, and we explained it in a very thorough way. Because first we looked at how the Jewish philosophers explain God. Then we looked at how you might read the Kabbalah without the influence of Chassidus, without the Tzemach Tzedek to tell us how to read it, which we read mostly in the Maharal of Prague, and his opinion. And the Maharal and the Rambam seem to argue. This was like a million chapters ago. This was a long time ago. And the Rambam and the Maharal's disagreement about the nature of God, we basically settled using the Arizal's Kabbalah, the Kabbalah of the Arizal and the Kabbalah of the Ramak, to basically explain how they are both correct. That God is, on the one hand, a being who actually knows with knowledge that outside of him, and he's completely simple. And yet, on the other hand, he is not removed and inert and totally abstracted away from the world, but rather interacts with and has a relationship with the world. And the way that these two things are possible at the same time is through something called Elokus, is through an intervening reality that is neither God nor the Creator, but is rather an expression of the Creator, which is part of the process of creating the world, which has many names in different places: God's speech, God's light, right? The expression of God, we compared it to teachings from a teacher. We had many different metaphors, and we're still going to have more, because it's a very hard concept to understand. In fact, perhaps it's slightly beyond human understanding, and it's in the final reckoning. Almost certainly, actually. Because we have this intermediate realm in which to operate, basically granted to us by the teachings of the Kabbalah, handed down through prophecy, we are able to basically figure out this quandary. We're basically able to make what the simple reading of the Kabbalah and the Rambam says in his philosophy about God, we're basically able to synthesize these two positions, and we come to a rather complex understanding of God. We have God's light, which is an expression of him in which he is not changed by what takes place in his light. His light goes into something called the kelim, called the vessels, which are limited, and whereby his infinite light interacts with the world. The light and the vessels are totally unified. They are as one. They are one thing, which is called a sphira, which is called a sphere, which together is the way that God interacts with the world. And using this idea of the spheres, particularly in the spiritual world of Atzilus, the highest of the four spiritual worlds, we've been explaining all different sorts of phenomena. We've been explaining how it is that God can know the creation, right? What does it mean for God to know the creation? How can it be that God interacts with the creation? Not just that he knows, but that when the righteous do good, they're rewarded, and when the wicked do evil, they're punished. And all of these things are none of these contradictions to God's infinitude or God's unchangingness, which has been a theme of the previous few chapters we've done, the fact that God does not change, that the creation of the world does not change the Creator one iota. that he is exactly as he was before the 6 days of creation. And the way that all of this is possible is basically through Elokus, through the fact that most of these things that we are calling changes do not take place within God himself, but rather take place within his light. His light itself and the tzimtzum which create it, as we've explained at great length, are not the tzimtzum which creates it as we know it, as we experience it in the world, as it exists within limitation, I should say, to be more precise. All of that is not something which contradicts God's unchangingness and God's oneness and God's simplicity, but on the contrary, they are extensions of it, because the reality of all of these things from God's perspective is really just more and further of Him, which we really explained very briefly and is explained much more at length elsewhere in Chassidus. But we explained how the tzimtzum is non-literal, which means that from God's perspective, there is no creation per se, the way that we perceive it. Rather, there is more of an extension of Him, an extension of His reality. All of this is in previous chapters. And chapter 9 continues in this same vein, although I think you'll find that because of the topic of chapter 9, we're going to get into all sorts of other interesting things. The last 4 chapters of this mimer, of this discourse, that Tzemach Tzedek is cleaning up the remaining of the 13 principles of faith. Right? The 13 principles, really the principles that pertain to God, which I think we said were the first 5. The ones pertaining to Torah and prophecy and all those other things and Mashiach are not covered in this discourse. But those of the 13 principles of Maimonides of faith that we're going through, so we have spent a very long time explaining how God is one, right? And God is unchanging and He doesn't have a body. But how can that be if He still knows, and He still knows the creation? That's what we've been in the process of explaining. And the last 4 chapters, we're going to be explaining more of those. The goal is that by the time we reach the end of the discourse, the Tzemach Tzedek will have covered at least the chapter headings, at least the essential aspects of what a Jew is obligated to know and believe about God, which, if you recall all the way from the beginning of our discourse, are not 2 things which are in contradiction, but on the contrary exist on a spectrum, right? What can be known about God, in other words, God as He expresses Himself within limitation, we know. And God as He is expressed above limitation, God above multiplicity, God in His infinite simplicity is known not through regular knowledge, because regular knowledge you can't understand anything like that. Rather, that is known directly through experience, through the soul, as we explained a very long time ago near the beginning of the discourse. So basically, we've very much clarified many of the different aspects of the limited and the infinite expression of God, and we're going to continue to do so. And in the process, we're going to get into some what I find very fascinating and actually rather thorny and difficult questions in Jewish theology, and the Chassidus' explanation of all of these things based on everything we've learned so far. So chapter 9, very broadly, because it sort of covers it from a few different angles, but chapter 9 is about will. Chapter 9 is about ratzon, God's will. We've spoken so far mostly about God's knowledge. We've also mentioned, I think, God's love, right, and God's severity, God's punishment, and things like that. Now we're talking about something which is very similar, but it's a little bit different, as we're going to see, and that's called God's will, or as it's called in the Hebrew tongue, in the Holy Tongue, ratzon, want, desire. As we know, it's characteristic of the Jewish faith, really I think of all the Abrahamic religions, at least the mainstream iterations of them, that God is not a being who is necessitated in doing anything, God forbid. He's not a being who does anything because it's His nature, per se, right? In other words, the way that an animal doesn't have any free will because he's only following his instinct and following his nature. On the contrary, God is a being who wants. He does things because He wants to, not because He has to or He's constrained in any way. This is a central feature of Judaism. Now, the problem becomes when God's desire seems to change over time, and that is the beginning of our chapter. The answers to most of these questions are very similar to what you may assume they are already from what we know already from previous chapters. I don't think, at least at the beginning, there's going to be any big bombshells, but the Tzemach Tzedek actually explains with a new metaphor or two things we've explained already in a very beautiful way. Okay, so let's get into it. That's my preface. I've printed the pages in the semi-correct order, where the only thing that goes in the wrong direction is the page numbers. Everything else goes in the right direction. This is read from left to right, just in case anyone's confused, because I know that this book is a challenging read. All right. So in English, everything goes from left to right of the pages. All right, so we're on page 269. Chapter 9, Tes. Vehine. Behold. Ma'ata navay levar. Now we can come to explain, Gamkein also, Hakushya be'inyan shinei ratzon etzle yizbarich. The question regarding the change of God's will. May he be blessed. Kameish anu emrim. As we say, Tzemach Tzedek starts right off at the beginning, in case you think that this isn't a part of Judaism, that God's will seems to change. We say, Yehi ratzon milfanecha. We say in prayer, may it be your will. We request from God that he should desire that he should build the Beis HaMikdash, right, as we say in Shacharis every morning. Which is a change from what at first he did not desire to build it. And therefore the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Now we want that he desires the Beis HaMikdash and should rebuild it. Right? We literally say in the morning, may it be your will that the Beis HaMikdash should be rebuilt. Implying what? Implying that right now he doesn't want it to be rebuilt, because if God wanted it, obviously it would happen. And we want him to change his mind that it should be rebuilt. It would seem, in the simplest reading of the davening, Yehi ratzon, may it be your will. In other words, literally your will should change. That the Beis HaMikdash that you want now to not stand, whatever your reasons are, you should want that it should stand. You should want that the Beis HaMikdash should stand, and obviously, we have to preface that it's not the same as a human being who wants something, but for various reasons is prevented from achieving it. God forbid to say such a thing about God, right? God doesn't want something, but He can't do it. On the contrary, if God really wants to do it, anything is possible, especially in Chassidus. Literally, anything is possible. Things beyond our ability to even understand what they are possible if God desires them. So obviously it doesn't make sense to say that that he wants to build the Beis HaMikdash now, it's just that he can't because there's all these things in the way. So what gets in the way of God, right? That's obviously, the Tzemach Tzedek doesn't say that, but I can head that off at the pass. That's obviously not an issue for God. So we seem to say, so if the Beis HaMikdash doesn't exist now, it must be that he doesn't want it to be there. And we ask every morning in Shacharis, we ask by davening, may be your will that you build the Beis HaMikdash. May your will change. V'chein, also, also, when we request a Yehi Ratzon, and may it be your will, that a sick person should live and should be healed from their illness. The intention is that he should change his desire, he should change what he wants, from this that at first he wanted the person to be sick, etc. We want him to change his will, that the person should be not sick. And so too it is with many of the prayers, all of the davening is in some way or another asking God to change His will. Which involve calling out a good will from God. And the philosophers, we're on the right-hand side of the first page now, the right-hand column on the first printed page, the philosophers already asked this question, already struggled with this concept. What's the struggle? The struggle is obviously, how could it be that the infinite, unchanging, and all-knowing God should change His will? That implies a change in God, right? As you've explained before, change implies limitation, change implies division, change implies something like embodiment, even if at a very refined and spiritual level.
Or change of will.
Right, well, that's what the change of will implies. That's the thing. The thing is that the change of will is actually, I suppose you're right. If you say no change whatsoever can happen to God, then any change is a change. But I'm saying that's why no change whatsoever applies to God, because if God changes, then He's not really one, as we've covered before at length, I believe. So it's a fundamental underlying idea in the understanding of God, the one God of monotheism, that he doesn't change. This is in addition to the pasuk which says "Ani Havai Shanisi," right? Which is the Torah aspect backing it up. As I think we've covered once before, I'm not positive, that we don't rely just on what logic says about God ever. Ever. We don't ever just rely on what logic says. We have to find proof from the Torah, because God, being that he is God and not bound by logic, our logical conclusions, no matter how sound they may seem, may not apply. It's only when God says, go ahead and apply logic, or God tells us directly that this is his nature, or tells us something about him, such as in the Torah, that we really know something for sure. So in a sense, all of the logicking, so to speak, and the natural theology and the philosophy, at least from the perspective of Chassidus, is trying to come to an understanding of God because God wants us to understand him, because it's a mitzvah. Not because on this understanding we can actually, so to speak, God is actually bound by this understanding in any real way, right? And according to Chassidus, God is bound by nothing. So the understanding is, on the contrary, the understanding is an outcome of God commanding us to understand him, not as an outcome of the human ability to understand the Creator, which according to most Judaism is limited, and according to Chassidus is almost a complete waste of time. Not a waste of time, God forbid, that's not what I mean. A waste of time without a mitzvah. If it weren't a mitzvah, it would be a complete waste of time. Now that it's a mitzvah, on the contrary, it's not a waste of time, you should devote your whole life to it. On the contrary, it's a different idea. But what I mean is that the idea that logically and through intellect alone you're coming to an understanding of what God can and cannot do is, according to Chassidus, preposterous on its face. There's no such thing. All right.
And what do the regular Hasidim believe?
What do you mean?
As opposed to the Lubavitch.
Oh, what other Hasidic groups believe? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not as knowledgeable about what they believe. I assume it's quite similar. The truth is that other Hasidic groups, their philosophy is not as thoroughly spelled out or systematic or as regimented as Chabad philosophy, generally speaking. Because Chabad philosophy, believing in the usefulness of the mind, as I just said, that the mind, generally speaking, is useless. But in Chabad, because God commands us to use the mind, and on the contrary, because the mind is the lowest place, and it too should be purified and should be lifted up and infused with faith and infused with the power of the soul. So the mind is really the ultimate battleground, and the mind must be conquered for God, so to speak. All of that is a more Chabad idea, as opposed to other Hasidic groups where the emphasis on the mind is perhaps less serious, although I'm not an authority, I don't know.
But it's a dangerous ground to tap on, because if you use your logic and you say, please God, change your will and make Springze by Gittel healthy again, it's like you're telling God, the fact that you decided that Springze by Gittel will be 6, it's not good. I know better than you what's good. You should make her healthy.
That's correct. Generally speaking, we daven because, again, it's the same idea. We daven because God told us to daven.
Right. So,
but now that we do, maybe we should try and understand it. And when you try and understand it, that's when the problems start. I'm giving you this from the Hasidic perspective. From the philosophical perspective, obviously it's not like that. From the philosophical perspective, traditional philosophy, when we talk about Maimonides or the Rambam or other Jewish philosophers, their approach, at least at the surface level, at least in other words, at least what they are theoretically devoted to, is explaining God from nature directly, just like you might assume they proceed. They look at the world and they see how the world seems to be, and from there they build an understanding of God and an understanding of the Creator in a direct way, and they say that based on the creation, this is how God must be, and they mean, according to all laws of logic, God must be that, and that's basically the end of it. What Chabad Chassidus does, and what Chassidus says in general, is it plays with that perspective a little bit, and it says, you're right, that's what God must be, insofar as God bounds himself within the rules of intellect. Insofar as God lowers himself down to be understood within the mind, he does follow the rules of logic, because God himself told us that he created the world with an order and he created it with logic, right? And all of these different things you learn out from the Torah. So God does in a sense present himself in a way that he can be understood in such a fashion, but don't make the mistake that this is God himself and that he's bound by the conclusions of this. If God wanted, he could make logic differently. Logic itself is a creation, which is a very radical thing to say, especially to a philosopher. Right? This is a radical perspective, and it's the Hasidic perspective. It's also the way that every 4-year-old understands God, which is non-coincidental. That is on purpose. When you tell a child God can do anything, that's what they assume. They assume anything is anything. And all of these hundreds and thousands of pages of Maimarim are to bring you back to that understanding, right? That's how it works. Okay. So the philosophers struggled, all of which, I wouldn't have gone on such a diversion, but all of which has direct bearing on what we're talking about now. Because the question is, God, insofar as he is bound by logic, right, which is the assumption of all such questions, obviously, right, as I've said many times before, God can do anything is the nuclear option, right? Like the Senate has a nuclear option. So the idea that God can do anything is the Hasidic nuclear option. You only want to resort to, it's a matter of absolute last resort, because if you say God can do anything about everything, then there's no answer to any question. The answer to why is the sky blue is God can do anything. The answer to how can his will change and yet he remains unchanged? The answer is God can do anything. Any question. Well, there's no answer to any question then, right? So then, if you want to be, even though at some level that's true, so then why are you learning a mimer? It's like why are you even trying to understand, right? Insofar as we're trying to understand, right? This is always the perspective of learning the mimer. Insofar as we're trying to, before you get to the fact that it's nevuah and it comes from Rebbe, that's the next level, right? It's complicated. But before, at least the worldly perspective, the world from the simplest and the most worldly perspective, the perspective is insofar as I'm trying to understand God, so these seem to be the rules, right? In other words, insofar as seichel, insofar as my mind is bound by rules of logic, of which I cannot imagine the opposite. My mind cannot understand how something can both be or not be at the same time, right? Or how you could have a square circle, right? Or something which is purple and red at the same time, or a bush that burns with a consuming fire that is not consumed at the same time, right? Things like that. Or the ark has no measure, right? The ark both has a measure and doesn't have a measure at the same time. Things like this are not for the mind simply can't grasp them. I don't even know what that is. You can't even imagine them being. You can't even imagine it, right? So we're not dealing with anything at that level. I think this is a good thing to mention on the first class of the new season, because it's important. Insofar as we're trying to understand, insofar as we're using our minds, which can't imagine and cannot grasp these higher and supra-rational realities, so we have questions. And the philosophers struggled with this question. What does it mean that God has a will that can change, and we ask God to change his will, and yet he is unchanging, one, and simple? Vehine. Second line on page 268. HaTosfos Yomtov ba'avos sham herich b'zeh. The Tosfos Yomtov, famous student of, anyone remember? Who's the Tosfos Yomtov? Tosfos Yomtov is a famous student of the Maharal of Prague.
What was his name?
His name was Yomtov Lippmann, I believe. Also known more famously as the Tosfos Yomtov. If you open up any standard Mishnah, you have the Mishnah in the middle, the Bartanura, Avajim and Bartanura is on one side, and Tosfos Yomtov is on the other side. So the Tosfos Yomtov comments at great length on Pirkei Avos, on the Mishnah. B'mashakasav HaRambam B'das Chazal, explaining how the Rambam explains the sage's position. Let's do footnote 3, which is like the background. There, the Tosfos Yomtov states that the Rambam explains that miracles do not represent a change in God's will, because he implanted them within the order of the world from the very beginning of creation. When he created the world, he ordained that the sea would split for the Jewish people. Hence, its splitting, and similarly other changes in the natural order, do not involve change on God's part. This is the Rambam's answer, I believe, in Moreh Nevuchim, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it even mentions it in Mishnah Torah. I don't think so. Maybe it does. The Rambam explains that God's will never changes. God's will is the same from the beginning of the world. God wants the world, but included in his desire for the world is everything that would take place in the world, including even the miracles which seem to violate nature. In other words, things which seem to go against the rules of the world. The Rambam will tell you they're not against the rules of the world, they're just very specific fluctuations in the rules of the world for that time. More or less, very roughly. It's the same will of God. Just as God creates a sea that he desires to lie flat and obey the regular laws of nature for all time, so too he desired that at a very specific moment, in a very specific place, the sea should stand up like a wall. But that was his desire from the beginning, not a new desire. So it's not like he changed his mind with regards to the sea. It was one desire for the sea, and inherent to the sea's nature, in God's will at the beginning of creation and the creation of the world, the splitting of the sea was included within that. As will surprise no one, the Tzemach Tzedek, or should not surprise anyone, the Tzemach Tzedek does not accept this interpretation and explains that Rambam could conceive of miracles as being willed at the time they occurred, because God's will, like his knowledge, is totally different from the will of mortals, and hence does not necessitate change on his part. In other words, we're going to explain this explanation, and this is the position of the philosophers, and then we're going to explain how we disagree, basically. So the philosopher's position, as I've said before, in trying to explain the Rambam's position on these matters, is that the philosopher's position is that God does not move, right? Everything else moves. When we say God does not move, we mean that absolutely, right? How does God know the world? Not by knowing the world as it changes, because that would imply changes in his knowledge. God knows the world by knowing himself. Right? So his will, his desire, his knowledge doesn't change. Because everything he knows simply by nature of being himself, which is apparently something that God can do, is basically the Rambam's explanation. A very similar thing is going to be by will. How does God's will for the creation, that at one time he wills the sea to lie flat, and at a different time he wills the sea to stand up, how does this not imply a change in the creation? And the answer is no. By nature of being the creator, he has one single desire. The object, the desire, the desired, and the faculty of desire are one, just like the knower, the knowledge, and the known, right? The desirer, the desideratum, as I believe it would be called from the Latin, and the actual desire, the rotzen, the koyach harotzen, the ability to desire, the will, these three things are all one. And what does he desire? He desires himself. And in his desire for himself, he desires everything, all in one go. In other words, God doesn't move. God has only ever desired one thing. And from that one desire, the world arises, and all of the details of the world arise as is. In other words, to what extent is God involved? It becomes more of a question. This is always the problem with the Rambam's interpretation. This is always the problem with the philosophical interpretation. Because the philosophical interpretation is bound by the idea that God ultimately, in his oneness, does not move. He has no faculties. There is no active interaction in the normal human understanding of it. Therefore, in a certain sense, God and the creation are separate. When God splits the sea, it is not God looking at the people of Israel on the shores of the sea and saying, "Oh, now I need to split it." That never happens, right? Just as God never looks at his children and says, "Oh, I feel love towards them. Let me reward them." Rather, it just appears as if God loves us, but really God himself feels nothing and is aloof and is removed, as the Rambam explains at great length, as I mentioned before. Not to be confused with the Chassidic position. I wish Eyal was here for that. So so too it is with God's desire. What appears to be a new desire for God, that God is performing a miracle to save the Jewish people, is really a one part and parcel with the same one desire that he has for everything else from the beginning of the creation. This is the philosophical explanation, as we're now going to explain inside the text.
It's very fatalistic. It means we have no role to play. Everything is predetermined.
Not really, because it's predetermined with foreknowledge, right? So it's not really predetermined. Then you get the question of good evening. Then you get the question of free will and that sort of thing, right? We're not so fatalistic. Not everything is predetermined, because of course human beings have choice, but God, knowing everything from outside of time, is able to have the desire for everything in advance, right? All right. That's basically the solution to the problem. So it's not fatalistic exactly, but it's interesting. In other words, the God-world interaction is sort of precluded from the beginning, right? It's not what you'd assume it is, right? Standing on the shores of the sea and Nachshon ben Aminadav walks into the water and the sea split, you think, oh my God, God is rescuing his people and he's performing the miracle. God's not really rescuing them. Now God had a desire for the creation of the water, and in the creation of the water, before all of creation, back in the 6 days of creation, God has a desire that the water at this specific time should split, because God forbid to say God actually sees and recognizes something changing within the world and changes the world accordingly. That's a philosophical, it's nonsense. Nonsense to say such a thing is the philosophical position. Yes? So what is okay? V'shebe emes, says the Tzemach Tzedek on the last line of page 268, the longest 4 lines to read in history. V'shebe emes lo kivinu chazal b'zeh chas v'sholom, that in truth the sages did not intend this. God forbid, the Tzemach Tzedek says. God forbid that this is the intention of what we mean when we say God should change his will in davening, that really he doesn't change his will and it's all the same will from beforehand. Ella, top of page 271, Ella daitam kedas Rambam atzmei. Instead, their position is like the position of the Rambam himself. Ukumasha kasav lamasai atir. When shall I pray? Let's read the footnote. That verse relates how Moshe asked Pareh when he should pray to God to stop the plague of the frogs. What the Tzemach Tzedek is saying is the verse implies that God's will can change from desiring that the plague continue to causing it to stop, right? In other words, why is Moshe Rabbeinu saying, when shall I pray and make it stop? Right, it doesn't make sense because everything was predetermined in the first place. The plague of frogs was predetermined from the 6 days of creation, and when it should stop is also predetermined. Right? It seems to not be the simple reading of the verse. In the simple reading, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, I can talk to God and make this stop anytime you want. Right? In other words, based on my prayer to God and my talking to God, he'll stop the plague. Right? That seems to be the implication. Moreover, it appears that the cessation of the plague was not determined at the time of creation, but rather was dependent on the particular hour that Moshe would mention in his prayer. That's the implication, right? Sheyesh shinui ratzon, that there is actually a change in God's will. The im kol zeh, however, says the Tzemach Tzedek, einay shinui ba'atzmusai. God does not change in his very essence, which should sound familiar. There's a change, but the change does not affect God in his essence, as we've said this at least 5 times about different things now. Right, about all different sorts of topics. There is a change, but it doesn't change God in his essence, lefi God himself, so to speak. Lefi she'en ritzonei kirtzonenu, because his will is not like our will. Kamei she'en chachmasei kechachmasenu, just as his. I think the opinion we were saying before was the Tosfos Yom Tov, because I think this is actually the Rambam's opinion. I think I might have made a slight mistake. We said before is the Tosfos Yom Tov, because I think this actually also fits with it. Let's see. His will does not resemble our will, just as his wisdom does not resemble our wisdom, because he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. Okay, so you have 3 explanations. You have the Tosfos Yom Tov commenting on Pirkei Avos, who I believe is interpreting the Rambam. I should have really looked it up.
That's what he said. Yeah.
The Tosfos Yom Tov interpreted the Rambam. The Tosfos Yom Tov interpreted the Rambam to say that what the Rambam really means is that everything is predetermined from the beginning of the world, and that the miracle is not really a miracle, and it's all built into God's original will. The Tzemach Tzedek is saying no. What the sages mean is what the Rambam actually says, which is that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, and He and His will are absolutely one. The interesting thing is that I think that the Tosfos Yom Tov is more in line with the standard reading of what the Rambam says. In other words, that does appear to be very similar, at least to what the Rambam is saying, at least in my very basic knowledge. Basically, that God's will does not change. God only has one will. The will is for Himself, but we don't understand how that will works. His will, He's able to have a will that perceives and affects and desires changes in a changing world without He Himself being changing, because He has a will that's above all limitation and all understanding, and it's His will, and we don't know what it is. And that's basically God is able to do it because He's God. His will is completely one with Him, and therefore He is able to desire changing things, and yet those things don't don't change him. He's not affected in the same way. He desires things by desiring himself. His desire is not that he's able to desire limited things by desiring himself. Now, I think that the Tosfos Yom Tov's interpretation is a fair hashing out or way of looking at what the Rambam is saying, basically. That because he desires only himself, the desire is really one desire, which is what the Rambam would say, that the desire is completely one. Just as we said, if you remember, we said about God's wisdom, that God's wisdom is completely one. The knower and the knowledge and the known are one. In other words, God knows everything by knowing himself. So too, the desire, the desirer, the desideratum, and the desire are all one. And by desiring himself, God desires everything. And what is the explanation of this process? There is no explanation. Only God can do it, and we can't understand it from our desire. His will and our will are not the same. His desire and our desire are not the same. Now the Tosfos Yom Tov reads this and he says, well, God only desires one thing. He desires himself, whatever that means. Which we don't know what it means, by the way. He desires himself, or he desires only one thing. And from that one desire, everything arises. And Tosfos Yom Tov interprets that to mean that God has one will for the world. And built into that one will is everything that happens. You have the miracles, you have the nature. Yeah, it's all part of one general will. Comes the Tzemach Tzedek and says, I'm not like the Tosfos Yom Tov. I'm like the Rambam himself. Meaning what? Meaning, going back to the earlier chapter that we were talking about before, where he reads what the Rambam says as Kabbalah. Where he's going to say that when we say that God is the desirer, the object of the desire, and the desire all at the same time, that means that there's a unity between the light in Atzilus, the vessel in Atzilus, and the unity of the light and the vessel in Atzilus, and they're all one. Right? In Atzilus, in God's light, in godliness, not in God himself. As we said in an earlier chapter about his knowledge. So in other words, Tzemach Tzedek is saying, I'm not going to read the Rambam like the Tosfos Yom Tov is reading it, even though in my humble opinion, the Tosfos Yom Tov's reading is more in alignment with what the Rambam says he's saying. That Tzemach Tzedek says, I'm going to hold like the Rambam. And what does the Rambam say? The Rambam says, Kabbalah, where is God's will united? God's will is united in the world of Atzilus. Which the fact that the Rambam is saying Kabbalah may or may not have been news to the Rambam. I don't know. The Tzemach Tzedek is saying, so we're not going to interpret the Rambam that way. We're going to interpret the Rambam as we've been interpreting him for 8 chapters. We're going to interpret him according to Chassidus and Kabbalah. To wit, as follows. Ubir Dvarav, the explanation of the Rambam's words, Hainu, is Al-Pi Ma Shekasov b'Sefer Yetzirah, according to what it says in Sefer Yetzirah, which I don't think we've mentioned so far in this discourse, I may be mistaken. The one of the oldest and earliest works of Kabbalah concerned with the nature of creation, attributed to various people, including Avram Avinu himself, forefather Abraham. Sefer Yetzirah is attributed to various different people. It says in Sefer Yetzirah, Eser Sfiras Bli Ma. It calls the 10 Sfiras Bli Ma, which means, in the literal translation, without anything. And it's a fair translation. Bli is without. Ma is different things in Chassidus. It means a lot of different things. Ma, first of all, means what. It's the question word what in Hebrew, like the beginning of the question, like, what do you want to do today? You start with a ma. Means what? Ma, which implies a lack of something, right? The question means that I don't understand. I don't know what the answer is. So there's a lack. There's a space for an answer. So ma implies bittul. Ma implies nullification, the negation of being. Yeah, the abnegation. I think it's often translated, whatever that means. So bli ma means without anything. Bli ma means like there's nothing there. So Sefer Yetzirah, the oldest work of Kabbalah, I believe, refers to the 10 spheres as spheres, 10 Eser spheres bli ma. The 10 spheres without anything. Explains it, Tzemach Tzedek. Bli ma, without anything, Pirish, means bli mahus. They are without essence, or they are without form, or they are without a fixed nature. There's different ways of translating it. The word mahus comes from the same word ma, by the way. Bli ma means without mahus. The mahus literally is the whatness of the thing, right? And that's the literal translation.
Whatness.
The whatness. It's the whatness of the thing. In other words, it's everything about the thing that answers the question, what is it? Right? Which philosophically, if you were speaking in philosophical language, in the Aristotelian language that Rambam would recognize, you would call it the form of the thing. Meaning to say, the aspect of the thing which makes the thing itself and not something and not another thing. Right? The distinguishing features of the thing. This is the only reason I'm mentioning it is because it's going to be important to understand the metaphor that follows. So the spheros are without the mahus, they're without the whatness, they're without the distinguishing features, they're without the unique form. They are not comparable to the mahus, to the whatness. He translates here substance, and then immediately has a footnote where he says he doesn't mean substance, right? Because you can't say substance about something which is physical, which is spiritual, not really, although you kind of sort of can, but the English word has all their own connotations, so he's saying in the footnote you can't. It's very complicated. But they don't have the same whatness, they don't have the same inherent nature as the soul faculties, hamusagim aleinu, that we can grasp. So the full sentence is, why does it say the 10 spheros blima, the 10 spheros literally without what, or without anything? It means that they are without, they lack the substance that the 10 powers of our soul have. Right? Now famously in Chassidus, the 10 powers of the soul derive from the 10 spheres of Atzilus, right? That's where we get the famous saying that's all over Chassidus, Mibsari echzalika, right? From my flesh I see God. From the makeup of the human soul, this is what it means in a more spiritual sense when we say that we're created in the form of God, or the image of God, right? Because the 10 spheres, the 10 faculties of the soul correspond and are made in the form of the 10 spheres of Atzilus. That's why Atzilus is compared to a man, Atzilus is compared to a body, right? All of these things are in the purely metaphorical sense, right? Because everything that's in the world derives from those 10 spheres, and particularly the soul of man derives from those 10 spheres. What we're saying is that the whatness of the 10 spheres of Atzilus is not the same as the whatness of the 10 faculties of the soul, even though there are parallels between them. Right? So we understand Atzilus as best we can from the 10 faculties of the soul, but they do not share the same mahus. They are not the same type of thing. What does he mean by this? We're going to have a metaphor, which is going to take up our last 4 minutes, yeah?
Atzilus then, does it still have God's full powers, or is it more at our level?
It's obviously both, right? That's why we talk about it. That's why it's important.
Well, it might have been by design to be limited.
It is limited. It is limited by design. It has both. Yeah, you have the light of Atzilus, which is infinite, and then you have the vessels of Atzilus, which are 10 in number, right? And limited. That's the whole point. That's why Atzilus is a useful reality, so to speak, for people who are trying to understand God, because it has both. It has the infinite expression of God and the limited expression of God, and the two of them are united in one. Derech mashal, as the metaphor goes, let's try and fit this metaphor in 5 minutes. It'll be an interesting squeeze. Let's see if we can do it. Derech mashal, as the metaphor goes, kamei. It's maybe a little too ambitious. Let's see. The ksivas be'etzba. The metaphor is writing with your finger. Yeah, shekesev is aleph. A person writes with their fingers. I assume he means through the intermediary of a pen. Maybe he means finger paint. I don't know. The letter aleph, right? Or you would say in English the letter A. It doesn't make a difference for the metaphor. A person writes with a letter in his with his hand, yes? The shape of the letter comes from the locomotive faculty in the hand, the ability of the hand to move, obviously. Right? The letter is shaped by the motions of the hand, which means that it derives from the ability of the hand to move and to form shapes. You would call it fine motor skills, right? Is what we would call it nowadays. And it is from this ability of the hand to move very precisely that you get all of the detailed shape of the letter. right? That there's a part on top like this, and a part on the bottom like this, and there's a diagonal in the middle for the letter Aleph, right? All of the detailed parts of the letter come from the ability of the hand to move precisely. Why is this important? Oh, one more. Everything that you find written on the paper was first a power in the hand with which he moved his fingers in a very detailed and specific way. In other words, you cannot make the argument that some part of the letter, which this is the upshot of the whole metaphor, that you cannot make the argument that some part of the letter on the page did not come through the intermediary of your hand. It's a rather obvious point, right? But he's making it clear. You can't say, if I write a letter with my hand, you can't say that some of this letter the letter comes from somewhere else. It circumvented my hand. The whole letter came through my hand. The letter Aleph was somehow transferred through my hand. Yes, which is more mysterious than we sometimes think of it to be. Maybe the im kolzeh loy haya. However, here's the wrinkle. The whatness, the mehus, the form of the letter that is on the page, my copies are disintegrating, was never, speaking of the forms on the page, it's okay. I think they're all disintegrating, unfortunately.
But finish the sentence.
The form of the letter that is on the page was never within your hand. This is the mystery. The mystery is somehow the Aleph or the A or whatever it is you're writing gets on the page. It comes from nowhere else except the power of your hand. And yet, you could cut up the hand and you could cut it off and you could look inside it and you could get in all the little pieces, and nowhere in your hand is the form of an Aleph. There is nothing shaped like an Aleph in your hand. Yeah, but it came through my hand. Yeah. I'm saying, where's the
If you take the brain, you'll find an Aleph. You'll find an Aleph? Your brain.
You find the direction that it gives to
No.
the hand.
Yeah, but where is the shape of the Aleph? Ultimately, if you believe, by the way, that you can find the direction of the Aleph that's given to you in the brain, you may have to say that the Aleph is ultimately resting in the brain. This is actually a debate in it's not really a debate.
Well,
It's basically a brick wall, actually, among neurologists and trying to understand the root of consciousness and all of these things, where basically I don't know about the shape of letters, but basically the experience of things, right? What's called philosophically, they call them qualia. Like, for example, the experience of seeing that the table is white, or whatever color this is. Where do you find in a physical brain, the experience of what it means whiteness? What it means for a subjective being to experience whiteness, right? And the answer is, it's a difficult question. That's what the answer is. V'loi medugmasam klal. You will not find anything at all like an Aleph in the hand. Shadehem agashmiyim betmunasam b'mehusam. Because the letters are physical. In other words, when we say the brain forms them, yes and no, right? The letters come out on the page. They're a physical entity. You actually have a physical letter on the page, in their form and in their whatness. But the power that moves them, this is basically what Barry was saying, but however, the power that forms them is spiritual. The letters are physical, but the power that forms them is spiritual, right?
You're really saying is all thought is spiritual.
Yeah, largely. But the thing is that the spiritual and the physical are obviously not separate, right? The spiritual power to form the letter, the form of the Aleph, here's the way it's explained in Chassidus. The form of the Aleph travels from your soul, from your intellect, through your lower faculties, which extend out through the rest of your body into your hands, and your lower faculties are able to transfer, in a process that is somewhat mysterious, are able to transfer this spiritual conception that you have of the letter into an actual physical form on the page. So it comes from your soul. Where's the Aleph? The Aleph is in your soul. That's the answer. The Aleph is a spiritual thing that's in your soul. It comes through the hand, and the hand writes it on the page with a physical form.
So go back to the $1,000,000 questions. What connects the spiritual and the physical together? What puts them together?
That's a good question. But one second, let's just finish the idea. Let's just finish the metaphor in our last 2 minutes here. A similar transition takes place from the Chachma, the wisdom of God in the world of Atzilus, in the Sphirus, to the creation of the human intellect. The intellect, which is formed from Atzilus, is not of the same whatness, is not of the same essence, of the same nature, of the same substance, however you want to translate that word, as God's intellect in Atzilus. The human intellect, we'll stop here and I'll have much more to say about this at the beginning of next time, God willing, but the human intellect, as it comes from God's intellect in Atzilus, even though they're both called intellect, what's the relationship between them? It's like the actual aleph on the page compared to the spiritual conception that the person has of the aleph before they write it. They are two separate things. You can go looking for a physical aleph inside the person, you can go spelunking inside a cadaver, looking for alephs and letters for your whole life, and you'll never find any. Right? Because the aleph doesn't really come from the physical. The physical aleph has a spiritual source. And it's the same relation within two spiritual things. From the human intellect to the godly intellect, it's the same relationship. The godly intellect is not of the same mahus as the human intellect. And it's very hard for us to conceive of this, by the way. In fact, in the traditional philosophy, as you were mentioning from the Rambam, there is no conception of this because there's no room for it. Everything is either physical or spiritual. What's this gradations in spirituality? We're saying that just as the physical and the spiritual are removed, so too this spiritual and this spiritual are removed at the same distance. How can that even be? The human mind has trouble conceiving of that. It's not something which is even found in our world. The spiritual nature of my mind is to God's intellect in Atzilus the same distance and the same break and the same different realities. They operate at the same. They operate on a different plane, just like an actual physical letter on the page and my conception of the letter in my mind. So if you went and looked for human intellect in Atzilus, right, like some people in Silicon Valley have this dream that one day all the minds are going to be integrated into one big computer, and the computer is going to be the central mind, and Google is going to take over and assimilate all human brains, and it's going to be the singularity, right? This is the techno messiah that some Michigan in California are looking forward to or something. So the point is, you can add all the human minds together. It's like adding together every letter A that's written in the entire world. Every letter A that's written in the entire world is never going to equal one human mind's conception of the letter A spiritually, because you can't get to the spiritual from the physical. So too, if you add together every human intellect, you don't approach anything. You're not closer to the God's intellect in Atzilus. God's intellect in Atzilus is a different type of thing. It's like spiritual and physical. That's the metaphor. I'm going to have more to say about it next week, because really this metaphor is really the Tzemach Tzedek, like putting his foot down and saying Hasidus is not like philosophy, which we can get into a little more next week. And remember, this is the beginning of the Tzemach Tzedek's answer to the question of what it means that God's will changes and yet He does not change. What does that mean? Yeah? All right. I think that's it. Stop the recording.